Okay, let me begin by connecting with what happened in Harlene's plenary yesterday and some of the things that Bliss talked in relation to this morning. One thing that was very central to Harlene's plenary yesterday was people starting from within the middle of confusion. Harlene saying, I just did not know what to do at first. Sheila herself talking about her first therapy session and just being totally disoriented, not knowing how to take an appropriate first step. And Carsten himself with, I forget whether they were nurses or social workers, but eventually him fixing on that question of how do you do respect? So the title of my talk, the word judgment, perhaps has a little bit of a bad press, and we continually talk about not judging people. But the title of my talk actually is Movements, and I make these kind of gestures all the time, movements of feeling and moments of judgment. And what I'm trying to do is beginning to develop a whole vocabulary, a whole way of talking that is appropriate to people coming to understand how to be sensitive to events, important events, from within the actual doing of a practice. I'm not interested in how you explain things. I'm not interested in how you write down theories and so on. My talk will, you may have, I've heard people say that John Schotter these days talks quite a lot about the difference between preparing and planning. I'm interested in how, at a practical level, almost like tennis match championship tennis players, you can do off-court and on-court practice ready for the big game. The off-court and on-court practice to do with preparing yourself for that moment when the opponent serves something and you're standing on the baseline full, poised, full of all kinds of resources that you have actually come to embody in all your preparing activities, ready to, utterly uncertain of what is going to happen, but you're going to somehow have a reply to it. So instead of saying about how you might decide to act in a situation, I'm going to simply talk about the whole task of coming to act in a situation in terms of what you think, in Wittgenstein's terms, is the best way of going on in that situation. And I'm going to say in coming to act in what you think is the best way for going on in the situation requires a lot of what I'm going to call imaginative work. Imaginative work. And this is the bit that relates to what Bliss was talking in relation to this morning. Imaginative work. And the images that come to play a crucial role in that imaginative work. Imagining Chicago is not to imagine something that actually exists. You can't go out and gather objective evidence. You're working in a situation where you're trying to bring into existence something that's utterly invisible, intangible. You're trying to bring into existence possibilities, but not just any old utopian possibilities that you think would be a good thing. Could perhaps even make a difference between possible possibilities and impossible possibilities. You're trying to get a sense of the possible or the real possibilities in the actual situation that you're in. So this is what I'm aiming at in all of this. Now, a central theme for me is, just to switch back straight away to the difference between planning and preparing. That kind of imaginative work simply can't be done but by a kind of planning, a kind of, I'm just going to now start thinking about it. There's a lot of other kinds of engaged activity involved in this, and that's what I'm going to start talking. And let me just point out, I'm using a special phrase here. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to try and talk in relation to it. I'm going to try and talk in relation to it because I'm going to try and talk in relation to my own lived experience of being involved in some of this kind of what I'm going to call imaginative work. Now, as I said, central to it is, and time again, people will hear me say the important things for me is one's spontaneous responsiveness. But let me put that slightly differently. I'm concerned with the kinds of things that just happen to us. Things that we can't plan, things that we don't bring about deliberately, but things which, well, there's a word people in conversational analysis use when somebody tells a joke, somebody else says, oh, I've got an example of that, and tells some quite different joke, but something very similar, and so it goes on. And they call it occasioning. Occasioning. You can occasion a circumstance where creative and innovative and important things have a very good likelihood of happening, even though you can't make them happen just because you want to. So I'm going to focus on events that just happen spontaneously, what the conditions are like that invite them or occasion them. I'm going to focus on the fact that the really important events, all this evidence-based medicine stuff and so on, objective facts, really, okay, you can have objective facts from now till kingdom come, but then they need interpreting. How do you use the evidence? And as soon as you're into interpretations, you're into opinions, people's beliefs, arguments, and so on, that gaining a nice phrase that came up in Harleen's workshop was answering to the calls of the situation, doing what the situation requires of you, answering to the calls of the situation. Well, that is something I'm going to suggest that we can make use of our bodily sensing or our bodily feelings to guide us in that. And actually, I've written a rather technical article, but the center of the technical article was the idea of what I called transitory understandings and action-guiding anticipations. And I think you can find in the fleeting dynamics of an unfolding event, you can find both those at work in you. I used to try, when I was living in America, explain this in terms students driving down, say, an 8-lane highway. And they're in the middle of the 8 lanes, and they have a sense of all the cars in motion around them, and you have this continual sense of where you are at the moment and the spaces in front of you that are closing up and others that are opening out and so on. And you have some, as pilots might say, flying by the seat of your pants. You have some gut feeling of how you're going to steer your own car in that unfolding flow of traffic. So another major change here, you perhaps heard me say in my workshop, I don't like using the word perspective or point of view because I'm really interested in the things that just happen to us as we move around in the world. Dynamic happenings that happen in the course of our moving around. Okay? In fact, I could just... my terrible friend Ludwig, he says, to get clear about philosophical problems, it's useful to become conscious of the apparently unimportant details of the particular situation in which we're inclined to make theoretical, metaphysical, all kinds of idealistic assumptions. Thus, we may be tempted to say, only this kind of thing can really be seen when we stare at unchanging surroundings. Whereas we may not be at all tempted to say this when we look about us while walking. So something that, again, Bliss, you mentioned the importance of movement. Movement's central to what I'm talking about in all of this. Okay, now, so what I'm going to suggest to you that the kind of talk that we quite often use, where you say, I made a decision to do this, I think we're mistaken in our talk. We come to act in a certain kind of way. Perfectly happy to use a phraseology like that. But what is involved in our coming to act in a certain kind of way, I want to suggest to you, is actually pretty complicated. If we make any decisions at all, now to put some flesh and blood into this, I'm going to use the example of Tom Anderson. Tom Anderson, later in life, what he was doing earlier was perhaps different, but later in life, he began to describe the whole development of his therapeutic practice in terms of road forks. Times when he said, I just had to stop doing something. It felt too uncomfortable. It gave rise to feelings. Now, I'll link it to Wittgenstein as well. Wittgenstein talked about his own inquiry as arising out of deep disquiets. He didn't know what was right, but he certainly had a sense that what's happening at the moment isn't it. Tom talked about the Milan group, people behind the one-way screen, having their discussions, sending a message to the therapist, so that the therapist would say to the client, well, we've heard you say this, we've heard you say that, but we think instead of what you're saying, this is what you should think. And gradually Tom became extremely uncomfortable with that and made just the very small change of saying, instead of what you think, you should think this, of saying, in addition to. In addition to. And as Tom said about it, he said that this turned out to be a door that, so to speak, opened up a whole new world. Because without realizing it then, I would now say that either or belongs, instead of this, you do this. Either or belongs to a world that one can describe as immovable. and what we would also call the non-living, where as soon as you move into a world of in addition to, both and, you move into a world of activities, living activities. So as Tom noted, a very small change in words began to open up a door to a very big change in practices. And I think this is, again, a characteristic of the kind of themes that we're all turning to now. That it's not one single silver bullet, big change in principle. Certain small changes can be the beginnings as they develop of pretty big changes. But the thing that I want to pick up from Tom's way of working was that he said a series of road forks, and that working away in him was this feeling of disquiet, a feeling of not yet having arrived at that sense of feeling perfectly at home or in harmony with or in touch with the therapeutic context that he was working with. And he talked in terms of a restlessness in my body that won't leave me alone. A restlessness in my body that won't leave me alone. A felt tension. Now, I'm going to make quite a lot of that we go into a confusing situation. We obviously feel anxious, fear, but gradually there's that kind of tension. And I want to say it's a qualitatively distinct situation. That felt tension is of this particular kind, related to this particular situation. And I want to suggest to you it's actually the best measuring instrument that you've got. Because as you move around, and this is the movement bit, as you move around in that situation, that tension will change. It will give you some sense of the value or the meaning of your movements in that situation. Now, the bit that really grabbed me in what Tom said about his own practice, he said, okay, I was going in this direction. I feel I can't go in this direction anymore. It's too ethically uncomfortable. As soon as I turned in another direction, and I'm going to put words into Tom's mouth here, and I start spontaneously responding to this new situation and begin to get a sense of its character. He said, the alternatives began to pop up almost on their own. Now, it's this popping up that I want to talk in relation to a little bit more. But I do just want to add, before I begin that just a little bit more of what Tom said about this. Oh, I can't find it, I'll remember it. He said it absolutely was not a rational decision-making process. That he was fundamentally reliant on the way in which his bodily feelings steered him in these road forks, and him not being able to go in one direction any further, and how the alternatives began to emerge once he turned in a new direction. So that's the theme that I want to talk about. And let me do it in this way. In my workshop yesterday, you perhaps will have heard me suggest that we use this word problems, and we continually say, how can we solve problems? And again, this is where I'd like to make a small vocabulary change. I'd want to suggest that we face two kinds of difficulties in our lives. One kind of difficulty that could be formulated as a problem, and you can put that into some kind of theoretical framework, some framework which gives you the resources to think about it, and you can arrive at a solution to it. And then, of course, if you're a physicist or something, you invent an experiment where you try to put that theoretical solution to some kind of empirical test and so on. That you can arrive at a solution to a problem by thinking about it. And I don't want to denigrate that in any way. Obviously, it's an amazing capacity of thought that we have and produced enormous benefits to us. But I want to suggest that those of us who are much more concerned to work in people sphere, that our major difficulty in working with other people is, now Wittgenstein called them difficulties of the will. And of course, like the word judgment, the word will doesn't have very much of a currency in modern psychological thought. Willful activity, we don't know what the will is. But as you read more of Wittgenstein, two of the most famous bits of Wittgenstein have almost become common parlance to us now. We talk about not knowing how to go on in a situation because we don't know our way around inside it. We don't know how should we look at, how should we listen to, how should we get in touch with our surroundings. So as you read more of Wittgenstein, you realize when he talks about what he calls a difficulty of the will, another way of putting it would be to say these are difficulties of orientation. These are difficulties of ways of relating. How shall we relate to this situation? And of course here we get straight into what Harleen would call her philosophical stance, wherever Harleen is, that adopting a certain way of relating, as Tom said, as soon as I later began to realize, as we switch from an either-or way of working to a both-and way of working, we had actually changed our orientation, our way of relating to our clients. Instead of treating them as immovable, dead objects, we treated them as we've taken a first step on the way to treating them as living, moving beings. So that small change in language was an indication of a much larger change, I would say, in orientation or attitude to people. A change in, and of course this is another theme that I would like to emphasize. When people are asked a question in a classroom or a seminar room, and they start thinking in terms of well-embodied and well-practiced schematisms of thought of an utterly generalized, decontextualized kind, they come out with certain solutions. But as I listen to people saying all kinds of things in the course of discussions in relation to particular cases, in particular contexts and so on, and Harleen, again, wherever Harleen is, said it out loud, oh there you go, that you can hear people in their ordinary everyday talk saying exactly all these kinds of relational things, things which are actually said in a particular way because the people saying them are talking in relation to or talking with the living experience actually there inside them at the moment, guiding their talk. You can hear this stuff is not in any way esoteric. It exists out in our everyday lives all the time. It's just that we don't know how to notice it. We don't know how to pay attention to it. So part of what I'm aiming at in introducing certain, I'm going to call them descriptive, not theoretical, descriptive concepts. The function of these descriptive concepts is to try and help us in our preparing activities. How to prepare ourselves off court, so to speak, so that in our actual practices we can, so to speak, remind ourselves to notice small and subtle events that really are ones that matter in the situation. The person's tone of voice, their facial expression, that significant pause just before they looked at somebody else, or small things like this. So, okay, these events happen. The things that we really need to develop and change our practices are already happening spontaneously out in the world. It's just that we and it's not that you've got to be a special person to have these capacities. Ordinary people all over the place are doing it. What ordinary people all over the place are not doing is abstract, decontextualized, professional, theoretical explanations of things. Okay, as I said, I was trying to put some living flesh into this by talking about Tom and Tom's way of working and alternatives popping up all of their own and so on. And wanting to say to you that a lot of the really important things are things that, quite literally, our bodies do for us. And we can be the beneficiary of them if we put our bodies in the right kind of place, in the right kind of circumstances. Now, I've been fundamentally influenced in this, quite literally, all my kind of life as in professional psychology and then in the communication discipline. Years ago, Hubert Dreyfus wrote a paper called Why Computers Must Have Bodies in Order to Be Intelligent. And at the time, he was influenced very centrally by a colleague called Samuel Todes, T-O-D-E-S. And Dreyfus has brought out Samuel Todes' book because Samuel Todes died a little bit young in life. And a central theme in Todes' book is him wanting to say we have a fundamental bodily need which we are very unaware of, to quite literally be in touch with, be related to our surroundings in such a way that we're poised on the edge, ready to respond to whatever might happen. That our bodies are continually finding for us a way to have that poised, balanced relation to our surroundings. Perhaps the most obvious example I can give you, if I switch the way I look from the little word Sony down there up to the light in the top corner there, my eyes, not quite so quickly as they used to when I was younger, but my eyes, without me willing it or calculating how to do it, my eyes converge on that point there, achieve a focus, I get a point of fixation, clarity and so forth, then I switch up to there, my eyes achieve a new point of fixation, a new clarity and so on. And I immediately have this understanding that that's near and that's far. It's a bodily understanding. The way my eyes work visually give me a bodily relation to my surroundings. Actually, our ears are even more complicated than that. We're picking blind people even without their sticks and whatnot, you try it yourself in the pitch black, walk towards the wall, and you will begin to hear the echoes of your footsteps change their character. And blind people have what they call facial vision. A blind person said to me, "Oh, I do love it when it rains. I can hear in 3 dimensions." These sensitivities which orient us bodily to our surroundings. I'll go one step further, where Toads would say, so our basic task in the world is not to try and get what we want, but to try to find out what it is that we want or need to get. That's a bit of a weird thing to say, that we don't at first know what it is that we want. And of course, people who perhaps overeat because they feel a certain kind of tension in their body. It's a loneliness, it's a lack of love, but somehow eating seems to relieve that tension. The task here is you have a certain kind of qualitatively distinct feeling of tension, and you've got to find out what it is. So this takes me into my next step. This my reference back to Harleen and Sheila and Carsten, starting in the middle of confusion, and me wanting to say, okay, you're in the middle of confusion, you can't just stop. Now, what am I going to do here? Because where are you going to get the alternatives from that you're going to decide amongst? A decision is something that you make among alternatives, but there are no alternatives. The situation is just too formless, too confusing, too bewildering. You have to start to move about. So I just want to try a little experiment. Because I said, okay, you can move about, and that's what you might do in practice, but you can also do it in the course of what you might call imaginative work. And of course, this is from me reading Wittgenstein. How do you read Wittgenstein? You can't read it like an ordinary book. You've actually got to do a lot of imaginative work yourself reading Wittgenstein. Let me just play with this. We enter a new situation. We're bewildered, confused. We don't know what to do next. However, as we move about in it, as we dwell in it, as we talk to people, as we observe a few other people doing things, a sense that the situation has its own particular character begins to emerge. An image occurs to us. Wittgenstein thought of language as like a city. We explore it some more. Another image occurs to us. Wittgenstein also thought of language like a toolbox. What kind of toolbox? A painter's palette? A sewing box? Carpenter's tools. What tools can be in toolboxes? Another image, and another image, and another image, and another image. It takes time. You've got to do a lot of exploring. But as you do the exploring, you begin to know your way about. A landscape for Harley of possibilities emerges. Once you know the landscape of possibilities, you feel able to go on with some confidence. Because you know you've done the exploring, you know there are no more possibilities than those you've discovered. You could be wrong. Okay, that's it. We don't usually talk that way. We usually talk in a very different way. We talk in terms of, okay, we're facing a problem, we've got to analyze it into its component parts, we've got to find a framework within which we can put those component parts to think about it, and so on. Years ago, and I don't know how old this is, probably 100 years old, Marx and Engels in the German ideology produced what they called 3 tricks for the construction of ruling illusions. The first trick was separate events, your data, the actual transcript, say, people's words or the things they do, from the actual people doing it and the context in which they do it. You extract your data, you abstract it. Then you find a pattern among the data so abstracted, and then you invent an agency responsible for that pattern. Chomsky's rules of grammar, for instance. But it's a complete invention. It's not got by that living in, imaginatively exploring the actual situation. It's an idealization, it's an illusion. And what's the point of it? Well, I won't again go into all the philosophical history of it, but if you read Descartes about proper methods of reasoning, he goes right the way through them and concludes, and if we had these methods, we could be masters and possessors of nature. The aim of those methods, as Marx and Engels realized, the production of ruling illusions, is to produce understandings in the favor of those who want to tell all the rest of us how we should live our lives. So let me wind this up with a number of just a number of observations to do with how might we become, what kinds of activities might be involved in us training ourselves, training each other to be more well-equipped practitioners. What's involved in training ourselves to realize that we have to come to do this imaginative work. Now, the word I used, you solve a problem and you resolve a line of action. And I didn't know, it came to light in later discussions, somebody asked me about the meaning of the word resolve, and I suddenly hit upon the, again going back to vision, we talk about a high resolution lens. A high-resolution lens gathers more light to bring it to a clarity of focus and so forth. Imaginative work involves all that gathering, exploring the situation, gathering circumstances that you're responsive to in some way or other, bringing them all together into a unitary whole. Again, that's a dialogical activity to do that, and I can't go into it. But learning how to do that judgmental work to produce a resolution in a situation, a better way to act, part of our training. Precise use of words, I won't say much more about that, but realizing that every word points to the use of other words, so you better be very careful about how you use a word, because without realizing it, you're directing people there's a certain whole attitude to a situation in the use of a single word. And the whole overall aim of this, I tried to formulate it in my workshop. I called it poised resourcefulness. You come to build up within yourself and your off-court and on-court practice all kinds of resources for drawing on, so that when you are actually there in the middle of your practice, you're poised with a certain kind of readiness to meet pretty much, one hopes. You'll never finish. This is never over. Years ago in the last picture show, there's a marvelous line. Somebody says, why are you leaving the town? And the guy answers, I'm not finished yet. And I applied that to myself. I'm not finished yet. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.
I'm going to say a few things that will give my side of the conversation. But I first want to start by saying I do think that you're talking about an important way of going on in the world. And I think that focusing attention on what I would call, if I were to rename your talk, I think I would call it the importance of gut feelings. It's about that, I think, in many ways. At least that's one way of talking about it and one aspect of it. That I see John's work as always being kind of a fighter against an Apollonian way of looking at things, of how we might have in 8th grade learned about the scientific method and about making decisions where you would weigh all the factors. When I was trying to learn statistics and standard deviations to give myself pleasure, I would list all the boys I was interested in and then rate all their characteristics and then weigh them and then look for the means and the standard deviations and try to figure out who I should like. And, you know, which turned out to be an empty exercise in that I did continually go with my gut for good or ill. The questions I have for John have to do, and I think you probably have answers for these, but there's this sense, yes, maybe our bodies are attuned to our environments, but that attunement must come not from our biology, but from our cultural heritages. By and large, we acquire our sense of, whoa, we're in danger, or I am lonely, or I am hungry, or I love the chocolate cake, in our cultural milieus. And so confusion and what is the situation and what is the call, it's the call coming from a place where we have learned to be. And so I don't think, I feel maybe you're not going to talk like, maybe you're not saying it, but it seems you have a kind of a naturalistic, biological, you don't want to say that? Okay, fine. It's not, it isn't a acculturated sensitivity, would you say? Acculturated,
yes. But why is acculturated sensitivity naturalistic?
No, I thought you left out that part. You just sort of made the assumption, we come in, we have gut feelings, we're going to get the call, and it will tell us, in a sense, if we're sensitive, how to go on. So we can talk about that over cocktails. But I do think it's important to pay attention to the notion that there isn't any sort of right or automatic connection between us and our worlds. Even sounds acquire their meanings for us. So I see John fighting against, and perfectly rightfully so, I think, fighting against the idea of this sort of who you love is based on the standard deviation and means that you kind of notice in your data, the scientific method. This is where I enter my side of our continual argument. That is, I think that the irony here in some sense is that though he wants to use the word descriptive terms as opposed to theory, John is developing a theory of human activity and human responsiveness and what helps us to be alive, spontaneous, productive, and safe in our worlds. So what he wants us to do is to pay attention in a new way to the relationship of our bodies to the world. And to me, he's creating a theory of activity. He doesn't like the word theory, and so that's what we fight about. But in a way, please pay attention to this. I think that's a very good message. So those are the points that I want to make today. By the way, John, in your last activity, when you were doing it, you forgot to say anything about body tension. And I think you would want to add that. Right? Thank you.
I was struck with the metaphor of driving on the freeway that you used, because that gave me a message that I could use in my thinking of where you were going. Because when I drive, especially if I drive alone, I'm not really ever driving alone. There are many voices going on with me. And if those happen to be dominant voices, I really don't know how I'm driving and where I'm driving. The outcome depends on what I sense going on on that busy highway. And if I sense it well enough, I'll get to where I'm going, and if I don't sense it well enough, it's over. And then I looked at this in the kinds of ways that you were applying it, John. And in some ways, it's something very ordinary, very normal, and I believe something we all do automatically, again, like we can drive on the highway and think about something else. But I'd like to specifically relate to it as a practitioner. I think it is important. Our alternative to entering into a new engagement as a practitioner to what the process John is describing, in my mind anyway, is to come in a planned way with the script of how we're going to act based on our agenda and not taking into account at the moment the agenda of the other person or taking into account anything other than our ideas about the agenda of the other person. I do believe in those practitioner engagements, and I use practitioner because I think this is just as true in therapy, in organizational consultation, in education, and the other domains in which we are practitioners. I really do think if we come in with that preset agenda, we are doing something to people rather than something with people. And something for me in how I have taken my journey with many forks over my 45-year career as a practitioner is that I have been becoming increasingly more humble about what I know going into that, and increasingly more curious and hopefully more open to what's going on with the other person. This is part of what I know some of you have heard me talk about, and my wife and I, is trying to be what we're seeking in our relationships with others, going again to the professional ones, the practitioner ones. There's no question in my mind that when I enter that consulting room with somebody new, no history, I'm sizing that person up and they're sizing me up. I also believe that the first things I say, my first utterances, and especially my first questions, are critical with what direction that discourse is going to go, not just in a few moments or an hour or in 6 hours, but for as long as it exists. With that, I really agree with you that the more aware we can be of ourselves and what we're doing at that moment to make our connection gives us very useful information about how to proceed and to allow ourselves to be spontaneously responsive to what we happen to encounter. One of the things that came in my mind was a story of 10, 15, 20 years ago. I know it was a while ago. Sharon and I did a lot of family therapy training in the Phoenix area. And kind of early in that training, we used video. We would interview people. We were trying to demonstrate that. We would video those in front of our class. We didn't have a one-way mirror, so we had to do it by video. It would be in one room with the camera, and the other room with the screen. And I was the one who was going to do the interview that morning, and one of our people, one of the learners in our group, was bringing in somebody she was going to be getting as a client, but hadn't seen since the client had gone into the state hospital for a psychotic break, and was just coming out that morning and being driven to our office where we did our training for me to interview. I was extremely uncertain, certainly confused. I wasn't oriented to what was going to happen. And she talked first, and that made it even worse. What she said was, "I'm sorry," and her words were slurred. "I just was discharged from the hospital. I'm on a lot of medication. I can't think straight, and I can't even talk straight." I had 10, 12 people watching me, and what the hell do you do with that? I could own my own uncertainty with it, and so the only thing I could think of to say was, if you weren't on those medications right now, how would you talk to me? And she did. And it went 1 hour with a very lucid conversation between us. And to me, that was a gut reaction, if you want to call it that, but it was just a sense I had in being with her, looking at her, making eye contact, that somehow if I could steer her a different direction, rather than the very negative one she put herself into, the very helpless one she put herself into, we could have a constructive conversation. And we did. So I would say for us as practitioners, being more aware of this process that is going to inevitably happen gives us a way of being that we can use more effectively in how we want to form the relationship with our clients. And my bias is those relationships are what are critical to change, not necessarily the words or the theories that we use, but those relationships. And if our way of being is to do that, we can more automatically do that. But yet, I think we always have to be aware of that starting point. So thanks, John, for emphasizing the way you did. For me as a practitioner, that's very helpful.
We are running out of time.
Yeah, I
Do
know.
you have a final comment? Or
Can I just say thank you to you both, and Mary, we're going to have to continue a tense discussion that has gone on for quite... Mary this morning said to me, John, that title, Ontological Social Constructionism, it's an oxymoron, isn't it? Well, that was the start. I do just want to take a couple of minutes, because... probably 1 minute, okay. A very nice, very expert practitioner student of mine sent me this piece of writing from Rilke, and I would just like to end by reading it. It's from a little book called Letters to a Young Poet. When the poet Rilke was asked by a student how to become as good a poet as Rilke, he answered, "Have patience with every unresolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms or books written in a foreign language. Don't search for the answers, which could not be given to you now, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now, and perhaps then, someday, far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer."
thank you very much to John Shutter, Mary Goegen, and Bob Cutter.